5,
4,
3,
2,
1,
go.
Hello and welcome to Space Now, the space news podcast from the National Space Centre that goes beyond the headlines. I am your space presenter, Ed Kellond-Turner.
And I'm space expert Dhara Patel.
Coming up today, whatever happened to those astronauts that were trapped in space? 2 months on, we're taking a look at their mission, what went wrong, more importantly, what went right.
And we'll also be taking a look at what's happening in the space sector, and we'll be setting you some stargazing challenges.
So, welcome Dhara, are you excited for our first episode of Space Now?
Yeah, it's so good to have this podcast up and running. It's been a long time in the making, and I'm really excited to share with our listeners all about kind of what's happening in space, but really getting into the nitty-gritty of the space stories. Like we've said in the intro, beyond the headlines and what we hear in the media, actually get into the real science or the real perspectives.
Fantastic, but you do a lot more than just podcasting right here at the National Space Centre. What do you do in your day-to-day?
So a lot of different things, and I think that's what keeps it exciting. So my role here at the Space Centre basically is about keeping up to date with what's happening in space and astronomy and then sharing it in lots of different ways. So podcasts is one, writing blogs, setting up and running events, all sorts of different things.
Absolutely, and you keeping up to date obviously really helps me out in my day-to-day because I'm an education presenter, so teaching schools, kids coming in, getting them excited, enthusiastic about what's going on in space right now, and hopefully we'll have a couple of kids listening in as well and finding out what's going on in space headlines. But it won't just be us, will it? We'll be joined by a couple of people, so I may be the host, joined by, for example, we've got Josh who will be coming on the show, and I might have to leave you in the capable hands of David and Zoe as well at some point.
It'd be really nice to have a mix of, our team essentially helping us with the podcast too.
Fantastic. But rather than dwelling too much on that, let's kick ourselves off with our first segment we are calling Space Wows. These are big or small stories that have caught our attention in the news. And I actually have one straight away, and it's actually about Eurovision. So nothing to do with space, but a little bit to do with space if you have been paying attention to Ireland's entry. Have you heard it?
I have seen short clips from their entry, yes.
Yes, it's an interesting
That's one word for it.
Interesting. It is called Laika Space Party, of course, based on the very, very first animal in orbit from the Soviet Union, Laika. So, yeah, what's your opinion on the song?
As much as Eurovision is a celebratory thing, and it definitely is a sort of party tune, I don't think it quite gets across the sentiment that we have for Laika. Laika being, the first dog in space, orbited around, and unfortunately, Laika didn't survive. And they allude to it in the song about, we hope Laika's still alive, and I'm like, she's not, unfortunately.
Yes, so that's what we're hoping to do a bit more with this podcast, is really actually delve into those topics and kind of explain what might be a little bit more of a difficult topic and really break it down for our audience, hopefully.
Yes.
But that's what I have been looking at. What have you been looking at?
So what I've come across this week is actually a story about an exoplanet. Now, we know of thousands of exoplanets, these planets that are orbiting stars beyond our own in different star systems. But this one is the first ever polar exoplanet. And what that means is that it's orbiting around a star. Now, normally, planets orbit equatorially, and that means they're orbiting in the same plane, a little bit like a flat pancake or a pizza shape.
So like all of our planets in our solar system.
Exactly. But this one is different because scientists have actually detected it orbiting in a polar fashion. So we're talking about kind of going from the north to the south, almost 90 degrees to what we would expect. And that's something that hasn't been seen before, and it kind of breaks the norms. We don't expect to find planets like this. And the wow for me, really, is that it's not just orbiting one star, it's orbiting 2 stars, brown dwarf stars, so essentially failed stars at the centre.
So you usually see one star and multiple planets. We're seeing one planet and multiple stars. So
yes.
The opposite of what you might expect.
Absolutely, and it's stuff like this that I find really interesting in the sense that we think that we know generally how things work, and then we get hit with these like nuggets or new discoveries, and it really does change our way of thinking. Perhaps we don't know how planets form around stars in general.
And I suppose it's an incredible discovery in our ability to discover exoplanets and things like that, because we're usually finding planets that are equatorial because they are wobbling their star as they're orbiting around it, or perhaps they're blocking out the light when we're looking at that specific star. So what an incredible discovery to find.
Yes, absolutely.
Now, to those of you that were watching the headlines, you may have noticed a little story about two astronauts that got stranded up in space. They were Sunita Williams and Butch Wilmore. They were experienced astronauts, so experienced that they were actually chosen to help test the new Boeing Starliner. So they launched on June the 5th, 2024, on an 8-day mission. Spoiler alert, they didn't quite make it only 8 days. Dhara, what happened?
Yeah, from 8 days to over 8 months. They actually spent, I believe it was around 9 months in space before they came back. And actually, like you said, they launched in June on what was supposed to be around an 8-day mission. It's testing a brand new spacecraft, and so they were aware that things could potentially go wrong. But what happened on their launch is their spacecraft underwent some issues, a number of different issues, and it meant that it wasn't safe for them to return on that spacecraft. So eventually, a couple of months later, that spacecraft came back to the Earth uncrewed so they could monitor it, see how it performed. And came back okay, didn't explode or anything, but it was probably a good idea not to have the astronauts on board. But what it then meant is that these two astronauts were left in space without necessarily a spacecraft to get them home. And it took 9 months for them to then get on a spacecraft and come all the way back home. So they actually ended up spending Christmas in space, which was unplanned for, Diwali in space, New Year. So yeah, quite a long journey or quite a long expedition, longer than they would have expected.
Yeah, I think I'm right in saying they almost didn't even dock to the International Space Station, which is their destination, because I believe it was some of the thrusters were acting a little bit wacky. They did manage to dock, luckily, but NASA do like to be safe with their astronauts, making sure they are going to be all safe up there in space, so I thought it was best to bring back the Starliner. But did they just spend 9 months kind of just sat around watching TV, or did they have like jobs to do?
I mean, it would sound like the ideal holiday vacation, right, to sit around and watch movies and TV, but no. After their initial expeditions, after their initial mission, they were actually put onto a full crew rotation. So they actually took the place of astronauts that would have instead been coming up to work on the ISS. So they would have been doing routine science experiments, maintenance on the International Space Station, things like spacewalks as well. So it's not that their time has been wasted. In fact, they are, like you said, extremely experienced astronauts. I mean, Sunita Williams, you know, she is one of the top female kind of spacewalkers, time in space. I know Butch Wilmore's had like 3 flights in space, so it's not like they were new to the situation, and I think they've dealt with the situation incredibly well.
But why were they even left up there that long? You know, America has its Crew Dragon capsule that's kind of operated by SpaceX. I mean, Russia has the Soyuz capsule as well. They have ways of getting them back down, so why didn't they?
So there's, I think, a number of different reasons. Now, when they first got stranded, they were looking at whether the Starliner could be used to come back. And there were quite a few weeks and even a couple of months of delay on that. So they were waiting and hoping that perhaps they could have come back. Now, in September of 2024 is when Starliner came back uncrewed. And after that, it was kind of like, well, we're going to need to use a different spacecraft to bring them back. We've talked about SpaceX. They have their Crew Dragon capsule. There's actually 4 of them that are continuously used in operation. So one of them would have been used to send up the previous group of astronauts and would have been docked to the International Space Station. The other one would have been used to take down the latter crew. A couple of them are actually used for private space. So one of them, you may have had something called the Polaris Dawn program, led by Jarek Eisenman. So one of those is actually kind of reserved for that program. And then the 4th one was being developed for the Axiom 4 space mission. So that's due to launch in May. So they didn't really have a spacecraft that was sort of free to use. Now, they could have used the Axiom 4 spacecraft, but instead what they decided to do was wait for the next crew rotation. So send up a new group of astronauts, and then Sunny and Butch would return with them after that 6-month expedition in space.
So that's what we're saying is, although it seems like they were stranded up there, actually that 9-month mission was planned after the fact they knew that Starliner wasn't going to be used to bring them back down.
And you're right, like they could have brought these astronauts back, but what you're looking at then is paying for an extra spacecraft to go up and bring them down. And we know that space is no kind of cheap thing, right? Like, it costs a lot to send astronauts into space. And also the schedule. So the ISS is continuously inhabited, and actually it's not just NASA that are sending up astronauts. You're right, the Russians with their Soyuz are also sending up astronauts. You've got private missions all in the mix as well. And so you're basically going to end up disrupting that schedule of planned flights. And so this seemed like the easiest, the cheapest, and also the safest way of returning the astronauts back home.
And I mean, this isn't even the first time that there has been kind of a scheduling error and astronauts have had to stay in space for a little bit longer. It happens all the time just because of weather. You know, they want to land in, say, the Pacific Ocean. What about if there's a storm there? They're not going to be able to land them. And as well, I remember a story fairly recently where there was a Soyuz capsule and they think it may have got struck by some debris and it broke a coolant line, and I think they said the internal temperature reached about 50 degrees. So they're definitely not returning on that. So that was another spacecraft that they weren't able to use. And yeah, it just happens sometimes. It's how obviously the agencies actually deal with the problem, right?
Yeah, there are different ways of working around it, and I know that 9 months also feels like a very long time to be in space. Most astronauts spend 6 months, but there have been astronauts and even cosmonauts that have spent up to a year in space. So it's no way like a record in space, but it is still longer than expected.
Yes, the record I think is over 400 days. So, but of course, that is absolutely nothing compared to, if we're looking at sending astronauts to Mars, well, that is 9 months on its own just to get to Mars, let alone getting back again. And they definitely don't have any starliners to get them back home if anything was to go wrong on the way to Mars. But yeah, so a lot of the headlines were talking about SpaceX and Elon Musk and saying that he is saving them. And he is the one that is actually kind of rescuing the astronauts. What truth is there in this headline?
I feel like the whole story kind of became quite politically linked as well in the end, and I don't think it necessarily helped the sort of narrative along with this. Now, it's true. It was a SpaceX Crew Dragon spacecraft that was used to bring these astronauts back, but it wasn't necessarily a spacecraft that was used just to bring those astronauts back. It was part of a planned mission. You know, 2 other astronauts were sent up into space in September for their 6-month mission in space, and then Sunny and Butch would have come back with them. So yes, SpaceX is, you know, the company of Elon Musk, and he will inevitably be tied with that space organization. But I think it's a little bit unfair to say that he's the savior at the end of this all. SpaceX have been developing the Crew Dragon as part of this commercial kind of crewed program for NASA, i.e. They're being enlisted and used by NASA for their services of delivering astronauts and cargo to and from space. And Boeing Starliner, this test flight, is for them to do exactly the same thing. It's just that they're still in that testing phase. So yeah, I don't know how far I'd go along with that. And I don't know whether you have any thoughts on whether Elon Musk is the hero of the day here.
Well, this thing, we'll get a lot more into this in our second topic about the kind of relationship between commercial entities and NASA and other space agencies. But the fact of the matter is, NASA paid for that, right? So there's only so much that Elon Musk can claim about that. But yes, our astronauts, they are back home now, recuperating back on Earth, getting used to actual gravity rather than microgravity. One of my favourite quotes, I think it was from Tim Peake, said the worst thing about getting back down on Earth after being in microgravity was how heavy your tongue is. It makes it really difficult to speak because you're not used to it.
I hadn't heard that before.
Yeah, fun little fact. I can't even imagine what that would be like. But we're going to be moving on now to our second topic, looking at the health of the space sector and how agencies are actually collaborating with commercial entities. Here on the Space Now podcast, we're all about helping you get more informed about the space industry so you can start making your own conclusions when reading those space headlines. And what we actually want to do is take an overarching look right now. And to do that, we're actually going to go right back to the very start of what we call the space race. Dhara, give us a very brief overview. What is the space race?
So the space race is essentially the very kind of beginnings of the space era, where we had 2 huge superpowers. At the time, the Soviet Union, now known as Russia, and the US, basically vying to one-up each other in the space race. And happening in the height of the Cold War, it essentially led to the Americans landing on the moon and winning the space race of that era.
So after those small steps, is there still a competition going on, or is there a bit more collaboration happening?
Yeah, we've seen a lot of change in the space kind of outlook in terms of it very much started off as a huge competition between these superpowers, but actually after landing on the moon, there was actually a lot more collaboration. We had things like the Apollo-Soyuz test project, where actually the Americans and the Soviets actually came together in space for that iconic handshake. We've had projects like the International Space Station. But what we're seeing now is this new dawn, this new space race of the 21st century. And it's not just those national organizations that are taking place.
So it's not just space agencies such as NASA or the European Space Agency or Roscosmos over in Russia. We've actually got private companies getting involved in the space race. But what is their place in kind of the modern day space industry? Are they just people that are contracted by, say, NASA, or are they actually people that are rising to the top and actually leading the way a little bit?
We've seen actually just, starting back, we think about these new space companies just being, from the past few years, but actually they've been decades in the making. So we're talking early 2000s. And what we do already see is collaboration between lots of different space agencies across the world. So anyone that's heard of like the James Webb Space Telescope, we know this is a collaboration between NASA, the European Space Agency, the Canadian Space Agency, and similarly, private companies do work alongside those national organisations. We, at the beginning of this year, saw a flurry of private companies sending instruments to the moon, sending scientific experiments, and we might think that, according to the headlines, it's just those private companies doing that. But they're actually contracted by NASA as part of something called the Commercial Lunar Payload Service Program, where NASA are basically enlisting the services of these private companies to help them take these experiments to the moon, paving the way for the Artemis missions, the next crewed human spaceflight to the moon. So yes, they can be contracted. We can also find sometimes them working in partnership with other space organizations. So that might be private companies working together. Not yet kind of in fruition, but we've got Blue Origin, a space company that maybe people may have heard of, but also a company called Sierra Space, who are working together to develop a space station, a completely commercial space station. So there's different ways that they can work together. Sometimes it can be collaborations and partnerships, and other times it can be through a service or a contract.
And we do also get competition between those private companies as well, actually vying for contracts, for example, through NASA. So I know we've got the Human Landing System, part of the Artemis missions, and I know that definitely SpaceX were part of that, Blue Origin were part of that, a couple more space companies as well, actually vying for those contracts. Is that right?
Yeah, and we see this, like you said, so in terms of going to the moon, but also with things like NASA taking astronauts to the International Space Station. So we talked about earlier on Boeing and their Starliner spacecraft being used to ferry astronauts to and from the International Space Station. SpaceX are currently doing that, and no doubt in the future we may have more private companies sort of getting involved in that aspect.
And I suppose something that we should definitely point out for any listeners as well is we're talking a lot about NASA involved, but actually the UK is also part of this. We've got private companies within the UK who are also actually supplying materials, supplying building parts of those satellites and things like that that are actually going to space as well. And the UK is also then part of the European Space Agency as well. So everything's sort of involved there.
It very much is, and I think it's really important to talk about at this point as well, very briefly. We've talked a lot about kind of human spaceflight and that element of it, but actually there's an awful lot that not just the national organisations but private companies also bring. Things like satellite constellations. So many people may have heard of Starlink, but there's also things like OneWeb, which the UK is a part of. There's things like Earth observation. So one of the things, it's not a pretty topic, but when we had the invasion of Ukraine, there was a company called Maxar Technologies, which were using their Earth observation images to help debunk some of the false news that were coming out from the war. So there's lots of different aspects of the private kind of space industry, and it's not just human spaceflight. And
now this is a big question, so prepare yourself. Is it a good thing? Is it good that we're kind of relying on these private companies, or should we be going, NASA and ESA, you should be doing everything, or is it okay?
I think it's twofold. So one of the things that people may have noticed is actually there's been this huge rise in sort of space and space technology, and I think that's been driven by private space companies. And so developing new technologies that then can find benefit here on Earth is a good thing. helping us understand more about our universe and about our solar system through the use of private companies is a good thing. But I think one thing we have to be really careful of is that the space industry is developing so quickly that we actually don't know how to govern it or to maintain it. And I think that's the bigger issue. It's not so much that private companies are here and they're here to stay. It's just that we don't have the law or the government to kind of make sure that it follows a smooth trajectory and we're doing things for the benefit of humanity.
Yeah, so we do have laws in place, or at least attempts at laws in place to kind of regulate things going on in outer space, such as the Outer Space Treaty or more recently the Artemis Accords, but those are signed by governments, right? So are private companies actually beholden to those laws?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. So the Outer Space Treaty is, what, 67? So we're talking about like decades old now. And it is a set of governing principles, which means that it's not specific in terms of, you know, the details. Very much when that Outer Space Treaty was written, there were no such thing as private companies. And so right now we have private companies almost fitting into the rule book, but it's not so well defined. And I think what's happening now is that we're getting to a point where private space companies are essentially almost making the rules as they go, and I think that's a dangerous place to be in.
Yes, it's one of those things where you said it's sort of a twofold benefit and an issue at the same time, in that we've got all of these private companies, and the way that they're all competing together is great, because one major thing of lots of competing companies is it drives down the costs for agencies such as NASA and as ESA. However, if you have all of those competing companies, suddenly they're all competing with each other, getting bigger and bigger and bigger, like we see with SpaceX. You know, they have got rockets themselves, they have got satellites themselves. At the end of the day, are they going to need people like NASA? I'm even thinking, talking like Rocket Lab as well. Rocket Lab has its own rockets. They also have their own satellite buses that are able to take things to Venus and Mars. Will they be able to just do their own missions rather than having to rely on kind of ESA?
It's again, I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with private companies taking the lead, but I think when it becomes a sort of one-man show in a sense, that's where the danger is. And I think right now we've got companies that people have heard the names of: SpaceX, Blue Origin, but there are thousands of other private companies that people may not have heard of. And also for us, and when we're thinking about the Outer Space Treaty and the fact that space should be for everyone, what about the currently non-spacefaring nations? Where do they sit in all of this? And if they've not yet got a space program, are they just going to be completely ruled out of it because everyone else has had a head start?
Absolutely. And I suppose another problem that what we're trying to solve here on the Space Now podcast is, in the headlines, what you will see is kind of SpaceX does this amazing thing, Blue Origin does this amazing thing. But as you're saying, actually a lot of the time we're contracting those. They are doing it because they have been paid to by NASA, for example, or maybe even perhaps they're actually only doing a very small amount of things, but that name itself will drive the headlines. So very exciting stuff. However, it's maybe something that we will focus on a little bit more in future episodes, as more kind of things, more missions that come up like this. But if you do have any questions that you ever see about any headlines to do with some of these private companies, please feel free to get in touch with us. You can email us at podcast@spacecentre.co.uk, or you can message us on a variety of social media as well. And hopefully one day we will be answering your questions here on Space Now. We want to bring you ways to engage with space for yourself. This week, we're hoping you find yourself under a nice dark and clear sky. And Dhara, what are they going to be able to see?
So we're actually within a galaxy season at the moment, and that means that it's the ideal time of year to be able to try and spot some galaxies. Now, there's not very many that you can spot with the naked eye, and actually last month in our Stargazing Challenges blog, we talked about the Leo triplet, so 3 galaxies that you can spot in the constellation of Leo. But we've always talked about the Andromeda Galaxy as the one naked eye galaxy that you can spot. So if you can find the constellation of Cassiopeia and use some of the stars in there, you might just be able to find a faintish blob in the sky, and you'll be looking at a galaxy that is 2.5 million light years away.
Yeah, that's right. If you see a smudge on your telescope, it might not be a smudge, it might be a galaxy.
And of course, if you don't have a telescope, then worry not, because in our monthly Stargazing Challenges blogs, you can find out a whole lot of different astronomy and stargazing things that you can look out for.
Thank you very much. But that does unfortunately bring us to the end of this episode, our very, very first episode of Space Now. Thank you very much, Dhara.
No, thank you very much, Ed.
And thank you also for listening at home. Make sure you subscribe to Space Now so you don't miss a single episode.
And just a reminder, we would love to have your questions, so do send them along to podcast@spacecentre.co.uk. See you soon.